My topic is the difference between doing something for duty and doing it for other reasons. In this episode of Philosophers Explained with me, Stephen Hicks, we turn to Immanuel Kant and his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1785, in which the most influential German philosopher of the modern era articulates and defends a conception of ethics based on duty and reason. Let's go to the text. Let's start with the title, which is a mouthful: Groundwork for the Metaphysic of Morals. Let's plunge into the text to unpack each of those elements. What's the morals? What's the metaphysic? What is the idea of a groundwork of the metaphysics of morals? Since my purpose here is directed to moral philosophy, I narrow down the question I am asking down to this: isn't it utterly necessary to construct a pure moral philosophy that is completely freed from everything that may be only empirical and thus belong to anthropology? All right, pausing there and unpacking a bit. We are looking for a pure moral philosophy, as to say, is purified from some things. And he's indicating partly an empirical point. We are not going to start with the evidence of our senses, look out at the world, and based on observations of the world, perhaps of our bodies and physical nature, try to derive moral principles that way. And then also partly a metaphysical point that is not going to turn on, as he suggests here, anthropological facts about the human condition, our biology, our psychology, anything that might be part of a study of human nature as it is not going to be relevant to what we are trying to generalize and trying to argue for as a moral philosophy. It's going to be purified. Now, why start this way? That there must be such a philosophy is self-evident from the common idea of duty and moral laws. So there are moral laws, they involve the concept of duty, and this Kant is suggesting is a commonly held view. Picking up the quotation again, everyone must admit that if a law is to hold morally, that is, as a basis for someone's being obliged to do something, it must imply absolute necessity. So, built into the idea of morality then is necessity of an absolute nature. It is a law so conceived. Example, that the command, "You are not to lie," does not apply only to human beings, as though it had no force for other rational beings, and similarly with all other moral laws properly so called. That the basis for obligation here mustn't be looked for in people's natures or in their circumstances, but must be found a priori solely in the concepts of pure reason. So it's not a posteriori after we examine the facts of nature, say. Rather, we look at reason a priori, that is to say, independently of all of that, and we're going to derive the moral principles that way. Also, the point about rational nature being emphasized here. He's arguing that suppose there were other species that had the capacity for rationality, whatever their biological natures, whatever their psychological natures, whatever anthropological or sociological truths we might find about them, they would have the same moral laws, because they are rational beings. So a lot built into these first opening paragraphs. Now there's more that Kant is going to argue as part of the commonly held understanding of what morality is about. And that is to say, not the nature of the laws per se, but one's motivation for following the law. For something to be morally good, it isn't enough that it conforms to the moral law. It must be done because it conforms to the law. An action that isn't performed with that motive may happen to fit the moral law, but its conformity to the law will be chancy and stable. So we want to do something, and if it's going to be judged as morally good, it's not that the action that we are performing itself fits with the law, that's a necessary condition, but also that we are doing it not for some other reason independently of it's being the law, and we are motivated to do so because it is the moral law. All right, with those prefatory remarks, we move into Chapter 1, moving from our common sense knowledge to philosophical knowledge about morality. If we take what we've said so far as our common sense understanding of what morality is about, with all of the distinctions built into that, now as philosophers we say, well, why? What does this mean more systematically, and what is the grounding for that? A strong claim at the beginning. Nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. So the will, and then we have to be careful about the words here. That which moves us or motivates us to act a certain way, that's what we're going to focus on as being the only thing that can be good without any qualification. This is a pretty strong claim. So we would then say, well, what about lots of other things that we might say are good, right, without qualification? Could a sunset, we say, well, that's a perfect sunset, right? Or the first kiss that you ever experienced, that was perfect and it was just good in itself. Or a satisfactory moral proof that one, a mathematical proof rather, that one has derived. Can that be good without qualification? Think through all of the possible things that might be candidates. Kant is arguing, or at least suggesting at this point, that only one thing in the entire world is an unqualified good, and that is the good will. Now, what makes a good will good? It isn't what it brings about, its usefulness in achieving some intended end. So it's not to say that it's a good will because I had this will, I acted on that will, and it led to some consequences or some outcome in the world that we judge to be good. So that then is to say the will would be good instrumentally, not good in itself. That is to say it's good only because by reference to some other good. And Kant is denying that that's the right way to think about the good will. Rather, a good will is good because of how it wills. That is, it is good in itself. Now, some examples then to flesh this out, because this is an important point, foundational point for Kant. So imagine someone who's just had terrible life circumstances. Through bad luck or a miserly endowment from stepmotherly nature, this person's will has no power at all to accomplish its purpose. Not even the greatest effort on his part would enable it to achieve anything it aims at. So we imagine someone who, for whatever reason, whatever he tries to do, he fails at it. He cannot bring about any of his intended purposes. He can't actually accomplish anything in the world. And it's not necessarily that there's anything morally wrong with him or in terms of something that we might blame him for. It's just the way it is. If this person has a good will and is really trying to act according to what his goodwill thinks should be done, then the goodwill of this person would sparkle like a jewel all by itself as something that had its full worth in itself. Its value wouldn't go up or down depending on how useful or fruitless it was. So we are then, in our conception of Kantian morality, totally non-instrumental, non-consequentialist, non-outcome based, non-practical results based. All of that is irrelevant to the moral worth. Moral worth attaches to something inside, so to speak, one's will and how one is using one's will. Now, why so? Because we know there are long traditions in moral philosophy, many of them coming out of the Greeks, that will say the purpose of our will is to will good things, but the willing good things will lead to good results. and we want to have a certain set of good results. We want to have a pleasurable life, or we want to flourish, or we want to achieve a certain psychological state of bliss, or we want to achieve salvation in another world. And we might also argue, as many traditions have argued, that when we are thinking about reason, we're not thinking about reason as this purified from empirical factors, but rather reason empirically. The job of reason is to work with the senses, to observe the world, figure out cause and effect patterns, formulate plans of action, and then rationally direct one's life in a prudential way or practical wisdom kind of way in order to achieve a fulfilled life, a happy life, whatever our conception of the good for. And Kant is saying all of those moral traditions are wrong-headed. Now, here's an argument that he gives. Suppose that nature's real purpose for you, a being with reason and will, were that you should survive, thrive, and be happy. So suppose all of those moral traditions. Well, if that were the case, in that case, nature would have hit upon a very poor arrangement in appointing your reason to carry out this purpose. And one of the reasons for that is that when we look actually at people who have a very cultivated reason, they're very smart, they're very intelligent, they're very wise, and so forth, those people seem to be the least happy people in the world. An interesting observation. What we find, in fact, is that the more a cultivated reason devotes itself to the enjoyment of life and happiness, the more the person falls short of true contentment, which is why many people, especially those who have made the greatest use of reason, have a certain hostility towards reason. So much for the drawbacks of well-being and happiness as one's dominant aim in life. Life is not about flourishing, surviving, well-being, happiness, whatever, and reason is not instrumental to achieving that as an end. We set all of that aside and reconceive the moral purpose of reason. Rather, it's based on the idea of another and far nobler purpose for their existence. It is for achieving this purpose, not happiness, that reason is properly intended. And this purpose is the supreme condition. Nevertheless, reason is given to us as a practical faculty, carrying on. That is, one that is meant to have an influence on the will. Its proper function must be to produce a will that is good in itself and not good as a means. Why? Good question. Reason and it alone can produce a will that is good in itself. So in the practical world, we are going to act. In order to act, we have to be willing something. But if we are going to be acting morally well, willing morally well, the argument here is that reason has to train the will, guide the will, or provide the proper rules or legislations or principles by which the will is going to will the right kinds of actions. That's the job of reason. My topic, then, Kant carries on, is the difference between doing something from duty and doing it for other reasons. So I will things, but my will can be influenced by all sorts of things other than my duty as described by reason. So that's the distinction that we now need to work on. More examples. Suppose we think about living and self-preservation, and we might say, well, I have an instinct of self-preservation, or I desire to preserve myself, and so on the basis of that, I will myself to do various things in order to preserve my life. What Kant is arguing is that that is not moral motivation with respect to self-preservation. You have a duty to preserve your life, and you should be preserving your life morally out of duty, not because you happen to want to preserve your life or you have an instinct, say, to do so. So here are Kant's words. It is a duty to preserve one's life, and moreover, everyone directly wants to do so. But because of the power of that want, the often anxious care that most men have for their survival has no intrinsic worth. And the maxim, preserve yourself, has no moral content. Men preserve their lives according to duty, but not from duty. So how would we know that we are actually acting to preserve our lives out of duty and not because we want to? We have an inclination to, we have a desire to preserve our lives. And so Kant gives us another thought experiment example. Adversities and sorrow have completely taken away this unfortunate man's relish for life. So someone doesn't enjoy life anymore. But his fate has not made him passively despondent or dejected. He is strong in soul and is exasperated at how things have gone for him, and would like actively to do something about it. Specifically, he wishes for death. But he preserves his life without loving it, not led by any want or fear, but acting from duty. For this person, the maxim, preserve yourself, has moral content. So the idea here is, if you would rather not live, you hate your life, you would rather die, and much in you is planning and willing yourself to take the actions necessary to commit suicide. If under those circumstances, nonetheless, part of you says, I have a duty here to preserve my life, and that motivation of acting on one's duty overrides everything else, the desire of suicide, the inclination to take certain actions, and you preserve your life without loving it, perhaps even with hating it, then you get moral credit. It has some moral content, moral worth. So ethics then is not based on egoistic desires or self-interested inclinations. It is impersonal in that respect. Now, this also has to do with how one acts with respect to others. Kant argues one has duties with respect to oneself, one has duties with respect to other people, and the important thing is that they are duties not based on desires, inclinations, and so forth. So, the example. We have a duty to be charitably helpful when we can, and many people are so sympathetically constituted that without any motive of vanity or selfishness, they find an inner satisfaction in spreading joy and take delight in the contentment of others if they have made it possible. So we think of a person who is motivated, say, by a love of mankind, a philanthropic motivation. It gives me joy to see other people improve their circumstances. And so because of that, I engage in various actions that are going to benefit their lives. That sort of person. Kant says, not a moral person as described. I maintain that such behavior done in that spirit has no true moral worth, however amiable it may be and however much it accords with duty. One should be doing charity, not for philanthropic reasons, that is to say, out of love of mankind or love of humanity. You do duty because it is you do charity rather because it is a duty, whether you like other people or not, whether you get any satisfaction from it or not. Now, consider another case. A person has been a friend to mankind, but his mind has become clouded by a sorrow of his own that has extinguished all feeling for how others are faring. So you're so sad, you're so depressed, you don't care at all about other people. He still has the power to benefit others in distress, but their need leaves him untouched because he is too preoccupied with his own. But now he tears himself out of his dead insensibility and acts charitably, purely from duty, without feeling any want or liking so to behave. Now, for the first time, his conduct has genuine moral worth. So, from the Kantian perspective, moral worth comes totally from doing things because one recognizes them as one's duty and for no other reason. You may have certain emotions and feelings and inclinations and desires attached to it, but those do not get the moral credit. And perhaps if we are in fact acting on the basis of those and not because you recognize it as your duty, you do not get any moral credit. So much then with these prefatory remarks for the first proposition of morality. For an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. And now another formulation of this, a second version, an action that is done from duty does not get its moral value from the purpose that is to be achieved through it, but from the maxim that it involves giving the reason why the person acts thus. So we do the right thing, and it might have consequences that we will judge as beneficial, as useful. We like those consequences and so forth. But the moral goodness of the action has nothing to do with its achieving the result. The moral goodness has to do with the fact that the person recognized their duty and acted accordingly. And then there's a third formulation of this, the third proposition, as a consequence of the two. So we have three ways Kant is arguing of saying essentially the same content. To have a duty is to be required to act in a certain way out of respect for the law. There are moral laws. I respect those. There's nothing to do with whether I like the moral laws. There's nothing to do with whether they're going to lead to good consequences. I am able to rationally conceptualize and recognize the properness of that moral law, and so I act on the basis of that. That's what a duty is. That is, I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. Now, further corollary here that Kant is teasing out is to say, if it is based on rational recognition, well, the rationality in each of us should be recognizing the same sorts of principles, as long as we're not being biased by our inclinations and desires and so forth. So an example here of why rational universalizability then is teased out legitimately from this concept of what morality would be about. Consider the question. Here's an example of making promises that you don't really intend to keep, a kind of lying. May I, when in difficulties, make a promise that I intend not to keep? And Kant then glosses this as saying, well, that's tantamount to asking, could I say to myself that anyone may make a false promise when he is in difficulty that he can't get out of in one way or the other, one or the other way? So what we're then saying is, if I'm going to say I should keep my promises, and we're going to consider that as a moral law, what that means when we unpack it is that I should always keep my promises. And what that also means is, even if I don't like the results later of having to keep my consequences, I don't let my liking override the fact that I recognize that I should keep my promises. It also means that I should be able to imagine other people in the circumstance, that if they make a promise, they too should keep that promise and not be swayed by inclinations and so forth. So it becomes universalizable to everyone, and it is absolute. That is to say, I'm not going to try to weasel my way or wiggle my way out of it when circumstances change. So if I tried to come up with some other formulation that, yeah, people can make promises but get out of it if they're clever enough, that becomes an impossible thing for me to say, oh yeah, that's good, that's the way people ought to behave. Immediately, I realized that I could will the lie, but not a universal law to lie. For such a lie would result in there being no promises at all. If I start lying when I am making promises, well, then of course I'm going to know that I'm lying when I'm making a promise. So I'm not really making a promise to myself. All right, and I know I'm not really making a promise. And it might also be that I then import that onto other people. If I say other people are like me, well, then when they make verbal promises, they probably also aren't really making promises, which means that I don't accept their promise as a promise. And the whole idea then of promises and their purpose and their goodness is just going to go away. It's going to make it impossible, actually, for us to make promises. Admitting exceptions undercuts the ability to make promises in the first place. It's an internally inconsistent, hence irrational way of thinking. Everything in nature works according to laws, and the laws are universal, they are causal, they are absolute. But we as rational beings, only a rational being has a will, which is the ability to act according to the thought of the laws, to act on principles. Everything else acts according to the laws, but we have the ability to conceptualize the laws, to understand the laws, and to direct our will to act in accordance with those laws. That's a distinctive thing about rational beings. And they command, and now we introduce the language of an imperative. In grammar, the imperative form is do this, don't do that. It's to give an order or to give a command, and so we have a command-based kind of ethics. Here is a principle, it is absolute, it is universal, I recognize it, I therefore have to follow it if I am going to function according to rationality. When the thought of an objective principle constrains a will, it is called a command of reason, and its verbal expression is called an imperative. So it's do this, not do this if you feel like it, or do this if you like the results, right? Or don't do that, and you aren't supposed to not do that just because you're afraid otherwise, and so forth. It's got nothing to do with inclinations, nothing to do with results. It commands one's rational assents. So here we have a distinction then, some terminology in the Kantian corpus between imperatives that are hypothetical. A hypothetical is an if-then formulation. If you would like to be healthy, then eat nutritious food. That's an if-then formulation. If you would like to be physically fit, then work out regularly. So work out regularly is what one might will, but one is doing it for hypothetical reasons. One wants a certain consequence. If the action would be good only as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. But if the action is thought of as good in itself, and hence as necessary in a will that conforms to reason, which it has as its principle, the imperative is categorical. Another formulation. A hypothetical imperative merely says that the action is good for some purpose that one could have or that one actually does have. The categorical imperative, which declares that the action to be objectively necessary without referring to any end in view, holds as an apodictic practical principle. So, instead of thinking of morality as here are some desirable ends or here are some things that I have some inclinations already to act on the basis of, and so I use my mind to figure out a kind of strategic plan that if I do this, that, and the other thing, that I'm going to achieve these ends that I desire or have an inclination to. All of that is hypothetical imperatives. And I might then say, well, I really have to do this if I'm going to reach this end, but that's still an if-then statement. That's hypothetical. What Kant is arguing about is that morality is a matter of do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, and it is completely independent of one's inclinations or the results. Now, one big picture way of thinking about this in the context of history of morality is in contrast to a certain amount, perhaps a majority of Greek and Roman morality that was about pursuit of pleasure or pursuit of flourishing or happiness or some conception of a life that is rich in various sorts of ways, that involves the body as having a certain set of goods and so forth. There is another conception of morality that is much more command-based that comes out of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And here we have a conception of morality that says something like there is a God, and God has commanded certain things. There are, say, the 10 commandments. And they're not 10 rules of thumb that you apply on various circumstances. They apply absolutely. You apply them and you act according to them whether you want to or not. And you act according to them whether you think they are going to lead to the consequences that are so good in the world or not. It's completely independent. You do what God commands independently of both of those things. Now, you might then secretly in the back of your mind say, well, if I obey God's commands, he's going to reward me in various ways. He might make me successful in the world. That tradition also expressed some reservations about that, saying, well, that undercuts the moral purity of doing so. If you're doing it because you think God's going to reward you with riches or make you more powerful or make your family prosper in the future, or you think that God will reward you by sending you to heaven eventually, or you are more fear-based and you say if you obey the commands you will avoid hell and various other kinds of punishments, but that all of those things undercut the proper understanding of this command-based morality, that God has commanded you act according to God's command independently of all of those other considerations. Now that tradition of morality, of course, comes down into the modern world to Kant's times, and what Kant is doing is arguing that essentially that is the right way of thinking about morality, with one big caveat, that Kant does not think that we can prove or make reasonable the existence of a God. So that approach to morality, absent there being a God as legislator and enforcer perhaps, can we purify that conception of morality from its historical religious context and see it as right in and of itself? That's what categorical imperatives fully purified will mean. Now, big question. The question now arises, how are all these imperatives possible? I've spoken about one thing we're against when we're trying to show the possibility of categorical imperatives, namely we must do this a priori without being able to appeal to any empirical evidence that such imperatives actually do exist. So when I look in the world empirically, sense perception, I study nature, I study human nature, I don't seem to find any categorical imperatives. I only find hypothetical imperatives. If you want to stay healthy, do this, that, and the other thing. Avoid crossing paths with lions and other predators and so forth. But those are all just hypothetical. I don't seem to find empirically any sort of categorical imperative. So how am I going to do this? If there is such a law, Kant then goes on to argue, it must already be connected wholly a priori, independent of anything empirical, with the concept of the will of a rational being. But in order to discover this connection, we must, however reluctantly, take a step into metaphysics. So far what we've been doing is morals, trying to unpack what Kant takes to be the common understanding of what morality is, purify it, make it more explicit, try several related formulations so that we are very clear about what the conception of morality is that we are trying to justify. Now, what is the justification for that? And we have to step from morality into metaphysics in order to try to find the grounding. But suppose there were something whose existence in itself had absolute value, something which as an end in itself could support determinate laws. That would be a basis, indeed the only basis for a possible categorical imperative. And Kant argues there is such a thing. We survey all of nature, we survey all of our inner nature. There is only one such thing that seems to exist in itself as having absolute value, and here is Kant's claim. It is a human being. I maintain that man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself and not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. What then distinguishes human beings from the other animals and beings that we are aware of empirically is our rationality. And of course, it's possible that there will be other beings that have this rationality, ones we don't necessarily know about quite yet. It is going to be the rationality that exists as an end in itself, or gives one the capacity of being a being that exists as an end in oneself. Rationality then becomes the prize, the moral prize, so to speak, but a purified rationality as discovered. And then Kant then goes on to say, look, that's why all of moral philosophy basically up to this point has failed. Look back at all of the previous attempts to discover the principle of morality. No wonder they all failed. Many of them have this idea of a human being as subject to various universal laws, but then they put the subjecting force out there in nature, or they put it out there in God. Instead, what we have to understand is that rationality is a self-legislating capacity. All man is subject to our laws, universal laws, legislated by himself, and that all he bound is to act in accordance with his will, a will designed by nature to be a giver of a universal law. So it's not simply that we are subject to the commands, but we also are the legislator of those commands in the first place, such as the capacity of our reason. Now, then what we have is further elaboration a little further down, and this is another variation on the third formulation. The concept of every rational being as one who must regard himself as giving universal law through all the maxims of its will, so as to judge himself and his actions from this standpoint, leads to the fruitful concept of a kingdom of ends. So let's unpack this a little bit. We are in a kingdom of ends, and kings legislate, kings command. But we are members of such a kingdom. So it's not merely that the king is some alien being above us in a secular form, or that there's some sort of a metaphysical divine king who legislates and commands, and that therefore all we do is submit to those commands. We are elevated to the point of being able to articulate and legislate those commands for ourselves. That's where we are going. Now it's interesting, this concept of a kingdom of ends. Just a little side note here, it's a quasi-political concept at this point. It's worth wondering, or asking rather, why this political model, however metaphorical, is chosen. Why not a republic of ends, for example, or just a democracy of ends, that we're going to legislate and vote in some way, or with a republic that we're going to generalize to certain principles that are absolutely binding upon all of us, and it's not really a matter of voting, or some sort of aristocracy of ends. That seems perhaps inappropriate. That would mean some people but not others, and that would defeat the universality. Or why not just more generally a society of rational beings? So the kingdom word is worth thinking about further, but at another time. So another formulation of the conception that we are going for: all rational beings stand under the law that each of them should treat himself and all others never merely as a means, but always also as an end in himself. This gives rise to a systematic union of rational beings through shared objective laws. That is a kingdom. And it may be called a kingdom of ends because what these laws have as their purpose is just the relation of these beings to each other as ends and means. So there's a kind of sociability that is built into morality. It's about how we are going to relate to each other as rational beings, and we are going to treat each other as means, but we're not only as a means, that in whatever we are doing, we are always treating the other as an end in himself. Now, then a parenthetical remark, but a kind of a big one. Admittedly, this kingdom of ends is only an ideal. Again, we are idealizing, we are philosophizing in this purified sense. We are not saying that this has anything to do with empirical, natural, physical facts about the way human beings actually are in the world. Now, Kant then goes on at the end of this section to say, this, of course, is delving a little bit into the metaphysics, and in order to understand my metaphysics and the fuller grounding of this approach to morality, one needs to read my Critique of Pure Reason. That's the first edition had been published 4 years earlier. That really is Kant's most important philosophical work. And so what he is arguing is that the conclusions from the Critique of Pure Reason are the basis from which the moral principles in this approach to morality needs to be derived. So for the really deep story about morality, one needs to read also the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, we have a Philosopher's Explained episode on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, so I would recommend that for those who want the deeper dive. But an important part of this is there Kant is articulating, of course, his concept of reason, this purified, non-empirical kind of reason, but he is also arguing that there's a distinction between the natural physical world, or what we might call the phenomenal world, and the ultimate real reality that lies beyond that, unfortunately, we are not able to know through reason. He also argues that his approach to metaphysics reaches some rather skeptical conclusions about the possibility of knowledge of the external world, that when we study this world empirically, it seems like we don't have free will, that we are subject to deterministic cause and effect kinds of laws. We don't find any compelling empirical evidence for the existence of gods or a god, for example, and so it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to prove the existence of God. It doesn't seem like we are able to justify the existence of a soul that survives bodily death. Instead, everything that we seem to learn from studying the world is that we are subject to decay and corruption and death. And so if we are then going to have any sort of a conception of morality that comes out of a God-based tradition, or belief in free will, or belief in the immortality of the soul, there's no way that we're going to be able to do that according to the Kantian approach. All of those things seem to be off limits. So this is going to be an idealized understanding of the possibility of morality absent being able to prove it at the fundamentals. Now, that is what Kant then goes on to argue in the latter part of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. I sometimes get the impression that many students and even many of the teachers of Kant's ethics, they kind of stop at this point in their articulation of Kant's moral philosophy, seeing him as an advocate of a kind of reason, the kind of duty, concepts of categorical imperative, absolute necessity, right, and so forth. But that this latter part is perhaps the most important part for philosophers of the groundwork, because it is here that Kant says not simply here's a list of what's good and bad, or here's how one is supposed to derive the things that go onto one's list of what is bad, but anybody can come up with a list. The question is, why that list? What grounds it? What makes it the right list, or the true list, or the best list? And for that, you need to do meta-ethics. And here is Kant's conclusions about the fundamental, most basic principles of his ethics. Freedom must be presupposed as a property of the will of all rational beings. So we have to presuppose that human beings have free will. If we're just deterministically pushed around by forces all beyond our control, then we are not moral agents. So we have to have freedom of the will in order to be moral agents. The problem is going to be that we cannot establish that we have free will. And that's what Kant is now turning. And that then leads to the big question, why should I be moral even if I'm going to make this assumption that we have free will? We have finally traced the determinate concept of morality back to the idea of freedom, but we couldn't prove freedom to be actual in ourselves and in human nature. We saw only that we must presuppose it if we want to think of a being as rational and as conscious of himself as the cause of his own actions. So it is a hypothetical supposition. If there's going to be such a thing as morality, then we have to have free will, and we have to conceive of ourselves as rational beings of a certain nature, even if we can't prove that those presuppositions are true. Now, suppose, though, that we make all of those presuppositions, that I am a free agent, that I have rationality, that I can conceive of categorical imperatives. There still is the question, why should I act according to these rationally generated principles? Why should I follow the categorical imperative? And here's the way Kant puts it. Why ought I, just because I am a rational being, subject myself to this law? And why should all other beings endowed with reason do so? Admittedly, no interest impels me to do this, for that wouldn't yield a categorical imperative. So what we have here then is a situation where Kant has said, all right, I am a being that acts, I'm a being that has a will, I'm a being that is rational, but I'm also a being that has various kinds of inclinations, I have emotions, I have desires, perhaps I have instincts, etc., etc. And what Kant is telling me is all of these things that make me in the here and now. When I'm doing morality, I should set aside the vast majority of it and just focus on these rationally generated categorical imperatives, even if they conflict with everything else about my human nature. Well, why? Why shouldn't I just say, well, I'm an emotional being, and so I'm going to act on the basis of my emotions, or I'm an instinctual being, and I'm just going to follow my instincts. Kant wants to say, no, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be following the reason. But why? Because it seems like my will could just select any of these things, so to speak. And he then wants to say, well, I can't tell you that there is some inclination or some desire in you that is really strong that leads you to want to obey these rational categorical imperatives. That would be self-defeating. That would be to argue in a contradiction, because I've already said that there can't be based on inclinations. It can't be that I happen to like being rational, or it really gives me an emotional charge to do my duty, and that's why I'm acting according to my duty. It can't be anything like that. So what on earth or out of the earth could it possibly be? So it seems like we are a bit stuck, and Kant tends to say, so it seems that all we have done with respect to the moral law is to presuppose in it the idea of freedom, as though we couldn't independently prove its reality and its objective necessity. And that's not really much of an answer. So he says, quite forthrightly here, if anyone asked, why should I follow these universally valid laws? What is the basis for the value of acting that way? How does it come about that a man who feels his dignity is attached only to acting in accordance with rational laws and so forth? So if anyone asks, what really is the basis for all of this, Immanuel Kant? Well, we couldn't give him any satisfactory answer. There isn't an answer on the Kantian corpus to, or at least not a rational answer for why we could do so. Now he tries a couple of other variations. He wants to say, well, we also seem to be caught in a bit of a paradox. I want to say that I am subject to laws, but at the same time I can imagine myself as a legislator of those laws to which I'm going to be commanding, but then I'm trying to legislate myself into a subject position, and that sounds kind of paradoxical, and there's a bit of a circle that might be going on here. And so he says, after trying a few of those formulations, well, it has to be admitted that there is a kind of circle here from which there seems to be no escape. So we really then come down to a bottom line choice. Because of this, a rational being must regard himself in his role as an intelligence, setting aside his lower faculties as belonging not to the sensible world, but to the intelligible world. So that then is to say, if we're going to get this morality project, we have to adopt a certain stance. I can't see myself as a sensory being, as a perceptual being. I can't see myself as my rational capacity is to work with that empirical stuff. I can't see myself as a body. I can't see the natural world or the empirical world with all of its temptations and possibilities as being. So I can think of myself that way, but if I'm going to be moral, then it seems like that's not the right way to go. He has two standpoints from which he can consider himself and recognize the laws for the use of his powers and hence for all of his actions. Here's the first choice. As belonging to the sensible world, he falls under the laws of nature. As belonging to the intelligible world, and is under the moral authority of the laws that are independent of nature, and so are not empirical but based entirely on reason. So those are the only two options. If we take the first option, then we're not really going to get morality as we conceive of it in the Kantian form. So we have to conceive of ourselves as members of the intelligible world, but this is a conceptual exercise, partly an imaginative exercise. It's some sort of a use of my faculty, distancing myself entirely from the natural world so as to conceive of myself a certain way, and that's the only way I can start to think about morality in the Kantian way. But all of that, of course, is suppositional. And that's not a very strong conclusion or satisfactory resolution, as Kant himself says. So the question, how is a categorical imperative possible, can be answered to this extent. We can cite only the presupposition under which it is possible, namely the idea of freedom. But how this presupposition itself is possible can never be grasped by any human reason. So I'm going to flag this for further thought, because one of the big controversies about Kant is in ethics, to begin with, is that he is an advocate of a reason-based morality. But here we, at the same time, find Kant that saying that reason cannot really answer its own questions, and that my understanding of this reason-based morality is based on suppositions that I can't prove to you are true. They have to be just a presupposition. And then more broadly, Kant as a member of the Enlightenment, as he is sometimes argued, and those who say that's not the proper placement for Kant, or the Enlightenment was about arguing that through reason we can answer all of life's important questions, but Kant here is saying quite explicitly that on perhaps the most important question, reason is not capable of answering it to our satisfaction. Carrying on, the question still stands. How can pure reason all by itself, without any outside help from other action drivers, be practical? How can the mere principle of universal validity of its maxims as laws create, unaided, an action driver and produce an interest in the world that would be called purely moral? In short, how can pure reason be practical? And Kant's answer is, all human reason is wholly incompetent to explain this. And it is a waste of time and trouble and labor, rather, to try. And I think this is an extraordinarily significant point when we're estimating Kant as an advocate of reason or not of reason, of a philosophical conception of human beings as rational beings to guide their actions in the world. And what Kant is saying quite explicitly and strongly is that on this fundamental set of issues, the ones that philosophers have been trying to answer forever, human reason is wholly incompetent. Concluding remark, as to my account of the supreme principles of morality, reason can't render comprehensible the absolute necessity of an unconditional practical law, such as the categorical imperative must be. If you want to complain about this, do not blame my account, blame reason. I have my account of morality, Kant then is saying. I think this account of morality is right. If we cannot give a rational basis for this, the fault is not with my account of morality, the fault is with reason. Blame reason. So even if reason does not seem to support this account of morality, this nonetheless is the account of morality that I am urging. And so we're left with a somewhat paradoxical conclusion at the end of the groundwork. So we truly do not comprehend the unconditional practical necessity of the moral imperative, but we do comprehend its incomprehensibility, which is all that can be fairly demanded of a philosophy, in that its principle forces its way out to the boundaries of human reason. So ultimately, morality is a matter of comprehending something that's incomprehensible to us and recognizing it as incomprehensible.